The Honourable David Parker.
Mr Speaker, of course, the National Party economic plan for this country is to flog everything off.
That's right.
There's no more depth to it than that. At any cost. I mean, what's the biggest part of their agenda this term? Sell SOEs.
That's right.
Changing who owns what already exists does nothing to grow the output of your economy. It's true of asset sales, and it's also true of our rural land. Mr Speaker, we heard a diatribe from the prior Speaker accusing the prior Labor government of selling or allowing the sale of rural land. Most of it was forests. The Minister's quite correct to say that. Most of it was, in fact, the resale of land owned by Carter Holt Harvey that had previously been sold into overseas ownership, moved back into New Zealand ownership for a day, and then was on-sold to new foreign investors. That's what those big hectares relate to. In any event, the lessons that New Zealand has learned as a consequence of what happened through the sale of our forestry sector ought to be a salutary lesson as to why it is that we don't want to make the same mistake in respect of all of our other rural land. There is no doubt that the sale of our forestry estate has meant that we've ended up processing less of our logs as a proportion of our total. There's no doubt about that at all. And if you want to see third-party commentators who have analysed that, have a look at what Brian Gaynor's written about that. How if you lose control of the ownership of some of these interests in land, you end up depriving New Zealand of the full value stream that flows from the use of those lands. There is no economic advantage to New Zealand of flogging off our dairy land. We know that from the analysis of the High Court when they overturned Minister Williamson's initial decision to sell to the Crayford Farms. The court said they weren't convinced that the improvements to productivity, to production, that would happen under the purchaser Shanghai Pengjin wouldn't have happened anyway from alternative purchasers. That's just common sense. We know that we are very efficient farmers in New Zealand and that we increase farm output where it's economic to do so. That's why we are successful in these industries around the world. These are our primary industries, they're our premier industries, they are the way in which we keep control of Fonterra. Ownership of land is what leads to ownership of Fonterra. That's being diluted a little bit through the share trading bill that this House passed without appropriate protections in respect of Fonterra recently, but generally land ownership is what controls ownership of our cooperatives. And those cooperatives have been very successful at maintaining vertically integrated ownership of a decent share of the profits that can flow from the land. We heard some assertion that this is all sort of some crazy economic vision being brought forward by the Greens and supported by the Labour Party. Well, you know, what happens in Japan? Very successful economy. Do they let foreigners buy their land? Actually, they are a successful economy, Mr. Banks. They would have a per capita income that's far higher than New Zealand's. They run a current account surplus year after year after year, unlike the New Zealand current account deficit, which has been 4 decades in length. They control their sale of land. So does China. What about the land of the free? What about the United States of America? Why didn't you mention them? Why wasn't the land of the free, the United States of America, mentioned? Because there are numbers of states in the United States of America who stop foreigners purchasing their rural land. 1 minute?
Yes.
Is this a 5-minute speech, Mr.
Yes,
Speaker?
It is.
Oh, right, okay, I thought it was 10. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are problems with this bill. This bill is not perfect. It does go too far. It says that no sensitive land ought to be sold. That's no land more than no rural land at all. We say that there are exceptions that need to be made. For example, if someone was bringing intellectual property, we're going to bring jobs that wouldn't otherwise occur, then we're willing to look at that as a matter of ministerial discretion. That can be fixed at Select Committee. We think that there are some revisions that are needed in respect of that. But it's better than the status quo. Those things can be fixed at Select Committee, and those changes ought to be allowed to be made by this vote, this bill getting the vote at first reading. Mr. Speaker, if parties can't evolve their positions as circumstances change, then democracy becomes moribund, and we might as well not have democracy, we might as well have dictatorship. Mr Speaker, it is appropriate that we have further controls on the sale of land.
Call the Honourable John Banks.